is evidenced by the fact that while Licinius made his capital at Nicomedia, Constantine made his at Sirmium. Both men campaigned against Rome's enemies to the north in order to justify the location of their respective headquarters, but there was no missing the obvious fact that they were basically living right next door to each other. The first time either emperor slipped up, the other was going to pounce. Next week, though, Constantine will eventually be able to stand the suspense no longer, and instead of waiting for Licinius to slip up, he will simply start poking Licinius in the eye with a stick. After enduring the prodding for a bit, Licinius will finally snap and demand that Constantine stop poking him in the eye with a stick. At which point Constantine will say, "Well, why don't you make me?" And then Licinius will say, "Okay, here I come." This time, it would be their final battle. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 136, Let This Be Our Final Battle. Last week, we left off in March of 317 AD, with Constantine and Licinius renewing their imperial alliance. For Constantine, the settlement was something of a disappointment. After all, he had beaten Licinius twice in battle, but two sunsets and some clever maneuvering on the part of the Eastern Augustus had conspired to deny Constantine outright victory. For Licinius, though, the settlement was a huge relief, a classic case of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. Well, stalemate from the jaws of defeat anyway. But you know, when you head into the endgame with nothing but a king and two pawns, stalemate and victory look pretty much the same. Licinius's position was far weaker after the settlement than before it, but he was still Augustus, he still ruled the Eastern Empire, minus what he had been forced to cede to Constantine, and perhaps most important of all, he still had his head. As I mentioned last time, following the settlement, Licinius returned to Nicomedia, while Constantine set up shop in Sirmium. Constantine wanted to establish his authority over the newly ceded Middle Empire, yes, but he also wanted to make sure that he was right on top of Licinius, in case the Eastern Augustus ever slipped up, so he made his headquarters along the Danube River. This meant, though, that the always volatile Rhine frontier, where Constantine had spent the majority of his reign thus far, was no longer under close imperial watch. This, as you can imagine, made the local Gallic citizenry nervous and hostile. Both the fear and the giddiness turned out to be misplaced, because everyone was about to discover that the always volatile Rhine frontier was actually still under close imperial watch. Now probably in his late teens, the newly anointed Caesar Crispus was dispatched by his father to govern the western provinces following the settlement of 317. Crispus would set up his capital in Trier, and for the next 5 years would run the government and defend the frontier better than anyone could have reasonably expected. He defeated German tribes in battle in 318, 320, and 322, and in the process demonstrated to everyone that he was every bit his father's son, a brilliant commander and a savvy politician. When father and son visited Rome together in 320, it is reported that the ovation for Crispus was louder than the ovation for Constantine. And while I hope it wasn't something as petty as jealousy that ultimately led to Crispus's tragic demise, it is definitely a possibility. Also a possibility is the fact that Fausta would bear two more sons for Constantine during these years, Constantius II in 317 and Constans in 323. Can the wicked stepmother trope really be too far behind? During the interregnum between the First and Second Civil Wars, Constantine and Licinius continued to drift apart not just personally, but politically as well. Up until this point, the two emperors had been rivals, yes, but they had more or less pursued the same policies. Round about 320, though, this began to change, and once again, Christianity was at the center of imperial division. Just as Constantine was stepping up his support for the church, Licinius was dialing his back, until finally he abandoned the Edict of Milan and renewed the persecution of Christians in the East. His persecution had none of the bloody overtones of the Great Persecution, but in the early 320s, Licinius began to target church property for confiscation and target church leaders for harassment. Back in 314, his political enemies had been the militant anti-Christians, and so Licinius had ruthlessly enforced the terms of the edict. But now that his rival was no longer Maximinus, and instead a very pro-Christian Constantine, the Eastern Christians, who had once been Licinius's allies, were now suspected of being dangerous fifth columnists. Licinius knew a political threat when he saw it, so he abandoned the edict and went after a group of people he probably rightfully suspected of harboring cross loyalties. But how hard Licinius pressed the renewed persecution is difficult to determine. Because Constantine would specifically cite Licinius's treatment of the Christians as one of his main reasons for going back to war, separating truth from propaganda is a tough assignment. What is a less tough assignment is determining the nature of Constantine's treatment of the Christians in his domain. Because with each passing day, it was becoming more and more apparent which religion was the Western Augustus's favorite religion. As late as 315, when his triumphal arch in Rome was erected, Constantine was still pretty vague about his religious beliefs. The arch only refers to the fact that Constantine was, quote, inspired by the divine, without naming any names. Even more interesting is the fact that nowhere in the depiction of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, a depiction which explicitly contains carvings of Constantine's various military standards, does the labarum, or the Chi-Rho, or any other kind of cross appear, which is pretty surprising, given the story we've all been told about how Constantine was ordered to conquer in this sign. But the omission of the Chi-Rho from the arch, curious as it is, also appears to be the last gasp of Constantine the Dissembler. From here on out, we move pretty decisively over to Constantine the Christian, the man who would one day become, literally, a saint. In the period between his victory over Maxentius and his coming victory over Licinius, Constantine's patronage of Christianity became wider and deeper. He sponsored the building or rebuilding of churches, he exempted clergymen from tax obligations, and, signaling the esteem with which he held the church leadership, when they traveled, he allowed them to use the imperial post, an honor that was reserved only for the most important imperial agents. And beyond that, when the bishops of the Western Empire were convening for the Council of Arles, a council which in and of itself points to Constantine's special interest in the church, he paid for all necessary travel expenses. The emperor still maintained his patronage of pagan philosophers and orators, and was happy to let them sing his praises on their own terms. But clearly, this was a man becoming less and less shy about openly promoting Christianity. And, as I said before, when he declared war on Licinius in 324, the defense of Eastern Christians would form the backbone of his rationale. Not that I found any direct link between the two events, but it is interesting to note that not long after Licinius started harassing Christians again, Constantine accidentally stumbled into the Eastern Augustus's territory at the head of a very large army. The official story is that Constantine had been north of the Danube chasing some hostile Sarmatians, and that they decided to flee southeast and cross the river into Thrace. Constantine couldn't very well let them just get away, so he followed, imaginary boundaries between the emperors be damned. Licinius, of course, took deep offense to Constantine's presence and protested, naturally suspecting that the whole thing was a contrived attempt to suck him back into war. If Constantine was looking to provoke something, though, Licinius refused to take the bait, and the Eastern Augustus stopped short of threatening military action. But Constantine was undeterred, and after a few more years passed, he tried the same trick again, at which point Licinius would be unable to ignore Constantine's aggressive disregard for the terms of their settlement. In the spring of 324, Constantine was once again north of the Danube, either campaigning against the Goths or the Sarmatians, depending on your source, and once again they just happened to flee southeast in Constantine pursued, and once again Licinius got a message saying that his brother emperor was camped out in Thrace at the head of a very large army. This time, Licinius was livid, and basically told Constantine to get out of his territory or else. This heavy-handed threat was all Constantine needed. Protesting that he was just doing his best to defend the frontier, Constantine announced that this was the last straw. He had stood by and watched as the despised tyrant Licinius, you see what I did just there? Had resurrected the evil persecution of the Christians, ignored his imperial responsibilities, and was generally living the life of a debauched villain. Citing in particular Licinius's advanced age and unpopular vices, Constantine declared that it was his moral duty to rid the empire of this imperial cancer. As spring turned to summer, Constantine finally got the war everyone suspected he had been trying to start for years. Both emperors immediately mustered the largest armies they could put together, as it was understood on both sides that there would be no settlement this time around. The troop numbers, while obviously exaggerated, speak to the seriousness with which both men took the coming confrontation. Licinius allegedly gathered 165,000 men, while Constantine led 130,000 of his own. It appears that both men could afford to concentrate such massive forces without weakening the frontiers, because their armies were in large part made up of mercenary forces, who would otherwise be the ones the border legions were fending off. Franks for Constantine, and Goths for Licinius. In essence, the whole Roman world, friend and foe alike, stopped what they were doing and focused on the coming civil war. In addition to the ground forces, each emperor also assembled a navy. Licinius's was there to protect the crucial Hellespont and Bosphorus crossings. Constantine's was there to seize them. In July of 324, the two sides were ready to have it out. Licinius took up a strong position at Adrianople on the east side of the Hebrus River, now the Maritsa River in Bulgaria. Constantine advanced to meet him and took up his own strong position on the west side of the river. For days, neither commander was willing to make a move. After all, crossing a river directly in front of enemy forces puts you at a considerable tactical disadvantage. But Constantine finally got sick of the staring contest and devised a plan so cunning you could pin a tail on it and call it a weasel. His scouts had identified a good possible crossing point a little ways upstream, so Constantine ordered a division of his men to make a very big show of building a bridge a little ways downstream. Licinius fell for the ruse hook, line, and sinker, and focused all his attention on the decoy construction project. Constantine then personally led an expeditionary force of cavalry and archers across the river at the upstream crossing. They took Licinius's army completely by surprise, and caused so much chaos in the enemy ranks that the rest of Constantine's army was able to cross the river unopposed. Once the two forces were on the same side of the Hebrus, the Battle of Adrianople could really get going in earnest. Though they'd been taken by surprise, Licinius's army was not just going to roll over, and once the initial shock wore off, they rallied effectively, and just like every other battle between Constantine and Licinius, the fight turned into an evenly matched slugfest. At some point in the battle, one of Constantine's flanks was even being pushed back, but, according to legend, he dispatched the Labarum to that corner of the battle, and thanks to its magical properties,